Hi, Lou here to talk about military logistics in history and game design. So what is logistics, or what are logistics? If we look it up in a dictionary, the detailed coordination of a complex operation involving many people, facilities, or supplies. That's the more general meaning. More specific to military affairs, the organization of moving, housing, and supplying troops and equipment. In military context, this is often equated with supplying and moving on a strategic scale the fighting forces. It is long-term, not short-term. It's primarily strategic, not tactical. What did Napoleon have to say about this? Amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. Logistics constrain immensely what an army or navy or air force can do. In other words, warfare is not just dudes on a map. It's not like the game of Risk at all. Think how easily units can move in Central Asia in Axis and Allies, for example. Even crossing huge mountain ranges and deserts, there's no logistics representation here. AAA video games are typically nonsense. You have stuff like Macedonia conquering Europe in medieval times, and no, it's not possible. Even tabletop war games tend to ignore logistics. Now that works fine for battles lasting no more than a few days, but also it simplifies the game. No logistics is simpler. Now let's take some examples of how logistics works. For example, the Mongols. Many amateurs, quote unquote, think the Mongols would have conquered Europe if the Great Khan's death had not recalled the Mongol armies. But when they moved into Central Europe, they only encountered the Hungarians and a small group of hastily gathered Poles, and they had a lot of trouble with the Hungarians. Yet much of Hungary is the only major natural grass plain in Europe, and Mongols needed grasslands for their many horses. They could have 5 or 10 horses each, so they could switch from one to another as they went along. They had to feed all those horses. Practically speaking, grass. Moreover, this is the era, 1242 more or less, where castles were all over in Europe, stone castles. And the farther west you went, the more castles there were. And the farther west you went, the less centralized the government was because of all those castles. Yes, the Mongols would bring Chinese to help them besiege cities, and that worked, but there were way too many castles. And you might consider the Mongols took more than 50 years to conquer southern China, even after they'd conquered northern China. And China was not littered with castles the way Europe was. And speaking of China brings us to another example. There are people who say the Japanese aimed at conquering China during the Imjin War, which started with trying to conquer Korea. They couldn't conquer Korea in the end, mostly for naval but not army failings. The biggest thing, though, is that China is huge. Korea is a little bit of nothing compared to China as a whole. Even in World War II, with modern weapons and transportation, China was much too big for the Japanese to conquer. This is why so many say it's a huge mistake to get into a land war in Asia, the sheer size. Now, coming back to games, games usually don't include logistics, except when they become resource management games. In a resource management game, which is common in video games, the actual fighting is kind of an afterthought because the resource management has decided who's going to win. But it's common for video games where lots of detail is expected. Remember, video games, you're not generally playing against somebody else, you're playing against the environment, you're playing against the game. Single-player video games are usually puzzles. There's an always correct solution. Plus, you can't lose. What more complexity does is make the puzzle tougher. but that complexity isn't presented in any realistic way. So what are some typical logistics rules in tabletop games? Typically, units must be in supply. They can trace a supply line to where their supplies come from. If not, they suffer combat and movement penalties, or they're snuffed out altogether. And even in early 1960s Africa Corps, there were supply units. Going to a higher level, for example, in my game Britannia, the overpopulation rule is a form of logistics. The number of areas that you hold limits the number of armies you can have. Another typical way to reflect logistics is to have action points. You spend your action points to take actions, but you don't have enough action points to approach even moving and fighting with all your pieces. You've got to pick and choose. You may even have to build up a big reserve of supplies before you can conduct a big offensive. Typically, games have terrain limits on the movement of units and supplies, unlike Axis and Allies or Risk. Sometimes resources such as oil limit movements or actions. But in general, we can say logistics is often ignored. One reason is that logistics rules are constraints. Now, while constraints promote creativity, most 21st century people really dislike constraints. They've been taught that constraints are bad, and that can include game players. The other reason why logistics are not often depicted in these games is complexity. And we can also say logistics is not sexy. Fighting battles is sexy. Dealing with logistics is not. Because logistics makes generalship something more than directing troops and attacks and defenses. You've got to plan ahead. You've got to make sure you've got sufficient resources. You've got to make sure you can get where you want to go. It makes generalship more complex. And many people, when they play war games, they want something that's relatively simple and straightforward. Thanks for listening.